For 3 days, the woman Thomas rescued from the shallow grave couldn't remember her own name. She spoke in whispers about betrayal, about being silenced forever, about secrets that were worth killing for. But when her memory finally returned and she told him who she really was, Thomas Kane realized that everything he'd believed about his family's past was a lie. And now, someone was willing to commit murder to keep the truth buried. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Colorado prairie as Thomas Kane worked to repair the fence line that marked the eastern boundary of his ranch. It was October, and the approaching winter meant every day of decent weather was precious for completing the repairs that would keep his cattle safe through the harsh months ahead. Thomas had built the Iron Creek Ranch from nothing over the past 15 years, carving a life out of the unforgiving wilderness after losing everything that had once mattered to him. At 38, he was a man shaped by solitude and hard work, his face weathered by wind and sun, his hands calloused from years of labor that had slowly healed the wounds grief had carved in his soul. He was digging post holes in the rocky soil when his shovel struck something that shouldn't have been there. Not rock, something softer, more yielding. Thomas paused, wiping sweat from his brow as he examined the disturbed earth. The ground here looked different from the surrounding area, as if it had been dug up and hastily refilled. A chill ran down his spine as he realized what he might have found. In his 15 years on this land, Thomas had discovered the bones of animals, artifacts left by passing travelers, even an old cavalry sword from some long-forgotten skirmish. But this felt different. This felt wrong. He was about to resume digging when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. A scratching, scraping noise coming from beneath the earth. Thomas dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to the ground, and his blood turned to ice. Someone was down there. Someone was alive. Thomas had never moved so fast in his life. He threw aside the post-hole digger and began clawing at the earth with his bare hands, following the sound that grew stronger with each handful of dirt he removed. 3 feet down, his fingers touched something that made his heart stop: fabric. Human clothing. "Hold on," he shouted into the hole he was creating. "I'm coming. Hold on." The scratching grew more frantic, as if whoever was buried had heard his voice and was trying to dig toward it. Thomas worked like a man possessed, his hands bleeding from the rocks and roots he tore through, his breath coming in harsh gasps as he fought against time and earth to reach the person trapped below. When he finally broke through into the makeshift cavity, a dirt-covered hand burst through the opening, grasping desperately at the air. Thomas caught the hand in his and pulled, using all his strength to drag the buried person toward the surface. She emerged like something being born from the earth itself, a woman, gasping and choking, her hair matted with dirt, her dress torn and filthy. She was alive, barely, her skin pale and cold, her eyes wild with terror and confusion. Thomas caught her as she collapsed, her body shaking with shock and exhaustion. She couldn't have been buried long. A day. Maybe 2 at most, or she would have suffocated. Someone had tried to kill her, and recently. "You're safe," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion as he carried her toward the house. "You're safe now. I've got you." The woman didn't respond. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and she seemed to be looking through him rather than at him. Shock, Thomas realized. She was in shock from whatever ordeal had led to her being buried alive on his land. Thomas's ranch house was modest but comfortable, built with his own hands from local timber and stone. He carried the woman inside and laid her gently on the leather sofa near the fireplace, then rushed to build up the fire and fetch clean water and blankets. As he worked to clean the dirt from her face and hands, Thomas tried to get a better look at the woman he'd rescued. She appeared to be in her 30s, with dark hair and delicate features that would have been beautiful if not for the haunted expression in her dark eyes. Her clothes, beneath the dirt and damage, were well-made but simple, the kind of dress a respectable woman might wear, not the gaudy outfit of a saloon girl or the rough clothing of a frontier wife. "Can you tell me your name?" Thomas asked gently as he wrapped a warm blanket around her shoulders. The woman stared at him blankly, her lips moving soundlessly as if she were trying to speak but couldn't remember how. When she finally found her voice, it was barely a whisper. "I don't know. I can't remember." Thomas felt a surge of pity. Whatever had happened to her had been traumatic enough to steal her memories along with nearly taking her life. "That's all right," he said softly. "The memory will come back for now. You just need to rest and get your strength back." Over the next 3 days, Thomas cared for the nameless woman with the patience of a man who understood suffering. He made her soup and tea, sat with her when nightmares made her cry out in her sleep, and never pressed her for information she couldn't provide. But he listened when she talked in her sleep, and what he heard chilled him to the bone. "Please don't," she would whisper, her hands clawing at the blankets. "I won't tell anyone. I swear I won't tell. The money, the papers. I saw everything, but I'll keep quiet. You don't have to kill me. I'll disappear. I'll go away and never come back." Thomas began to piece together a story from these fragments. The woman had witnessed something involving money and papers, something worth killing to keep secret. Someone had tried to silence her permanently by burying her alive, but their plan had failed. On the third night, Thomas was awakened by screaming. He rushed to the guest room where the woman slept and found her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror, but finally, clearly focused. "Elizabeth," she gasped, looking directly at him. "My name is Elizabeth Hartwell." Thomas felt recognition stir in the depths of his memory, but he couldn't quite place where he might have heard that name before. "Elizabeth," he repeated. "Do you remember what happened to you?" Elizabeth's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "They tried to kill me. My own family tried to kill me because I found out what they did." "What? Who did?" "The Hartwells." Elizabeth looked at him with eyes full of pain and betrayal. "I discovered that my uncle and cousin have been embezzling money from the family businesses for years. Thousands of dollars. Thomas, they've been stealing from widows' pensions, from the church fund, from the money that was supposed to go to the families of men who died in their mines." Thomas sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed. The Hartwell name was well known throughout Colorado Territory. They owned several silver mines, a bank, and had interests in the railroad. They were one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the region. "You're one of the Hartwells?" he asked. "I was." Elizabeth's voice turned bitter. "Until I found the ledgers that proved what William and his son Marcus have been doing. I confronted them, told them I was going to expose their crimes. That's when they decided I had to disappear permanently." "How did you end up buried on my land?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, as if seeing the memory again was painful. "They drugged me at dinner. When I woke up, I was in a wooden box underground. I could hear them talking above me, discussing how to make it look like I'd left town suddenly. They said no one would look for me here because this land used to belong to my family." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him. "What do you mean?" "This ranch, Thomas. This land where you've built your home. It used to be part of the Hartwell estate. My grandfather owned everything from here to the mountains before he died. But my uncle sold it off piece by piece to pay for his gambling debts, then told the family that the land had been lost in some legal dispute." Thomas stared at her, trying to process what she was telling him. "Are you saying I bought my land from criminals?" "You bought it legally. My uncle had the right to sell it. He was the executor of my grandfather's estate, but the money from the sale should have been distributed to the family according to the will. Instead, William pocketed it all and used forged documents to make it look like the land had been worthless." "And you found proof of this?" Elizabeth nodded. "All of it. The forged papers, the falsified records, the money that was supposed to go to my grandfather's other heirs. I have copies of everything hidden in a place they'll never think to look." Thomas leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what Elizabeth was telling him. If her story was true, then the Hartwells weren't just thieves. They were murderers who had tried to kill their own family member to protect their secrets. "Why didn't you go to the law?" he asked. Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "With what proof? William Hartwell owns half the judges in the territory and has the other half in his pocket. Even if I could convince someone to investigate, it would be my word against his, and everyone knows the Hartwells are pillars of the community." "But you said you have copies of the evidence." "Hidden where no one will find them. But even with proof, I'd need someone powerful enough to stand up to the Hartwells, someone they couldn't buy or intimidate." Elizabeth looked at him with hope beginning to dawn in her eyes. "Thomas, you said this land used to belong to my family. That means you might be one of the people they cheated." Thomas felt a spark of anger beginning to burn in his chest. He had worked 15 years to build this ranch, believing he was creating something on land he'd bought honestly. If the Hartwells had stolen the money from the sale, then he was as much a victim as Elizabeth. "Tell me about these papers," he said. Over the next hour, Elizabeth laid out the full scope of the Hartwell crimes. For over a decade, William Hartwell and his son Marcus had been systematically looting the family businesses. They had embezzled money meant for minors' families, stolen from charity funds, and falsified records to hide their theft. When Elizabeth's grandfather died and left his estate to be divided among his children and grandchildren, William had forged documents to make it appear that the land was worthless while secretly selling it and keeping the proceeds. "How much money are we talking about?" Thomas asked. "Hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. They've been at this for a long time, and they've gotten very good at hiding their tracks." Thomas stood and began pacing the small room. "And you have proof of all this? Copies of ledgers, forged documents, bank records, everything. I spent months gathering evidence before I confronted them. I thought if I showed them what I knew, they'd agree to make restitution and change their ways." Elizabeth's voice broke. "I never imagined they'd try to murder me. Where did you hide the evidence?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Why do you want to know? How do I know you won't just turn me over to them for the reward money they're probably offering?" Thomas knelt beside her bed, looking directly into her eyes. "Because they tried to kill you on my land, Elizabeth. Because if what you're telling me is true, then they stole from me too. And because—" he paused, surprised by the strength of his own feelings. "Because no one should have to face something like this alone." Something in his voice must have convinced her because Elizabeth reached out and took his hand. "There's an old mine shaft about 5 miles north of here, near Devil's Ridge. It's been abandoned for years, but there's a hidden chamber about 50 feet down where miners used to store supplies. I hid everything there in a waterproof case." "We'll get it," Thomas said firmly. "And then we're going to make the Hartwells pay for what they've done." "Thomas, you don't understand how dangerous they are. They have money, power, connections. They'll destroy anyone who threatens them." "They tried to bury you alive," Thomas said, his voice hard with anger. "They've stolen from dozens of innocent people, maybe hundreds. Someone has to stop them." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "Why would you risk everything to help me? You barely know me." Thomas looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how right it felt to have her touching him. In the 3 days since he'd pulled her from that grave, something had changed in him. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 15 years had begun to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Sarah died. The memory hit him like a physical blow. His younger sister Sarah, killed in a house fire 20 years ago, had been the same age Elizabeth was now. She'd had the same dark hair, the same determined spirit that refused to back down from injustice. Sarah had died trying to save their family's horses from the fire, and Thomas had never forgiven himself for not being there to help her. Maybe that was why he felt so protective of Elizabeth. Maybe saving her was his chance to make up for failing to save Sarah. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I've spent too many years running from fights that mattered." Elizabeth studied his face in the lamplight. "You're a good man, Thomas Kane. But this isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment they tried to commit murder on my land." Thomas stood, his mind already working on a plan. "Tomorrow we'll retrieve the evidence, then we're going to figure out how to use it." "And if they find out you're helping me?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Then they'll learn that some graves are harder to dig than others." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a kind of crisp air that warned of the winter to come. Thomas saddled 2 horses while Elizabeth packed supplies for their journey to Devil's Ridge. She had borrowed clothes from the trunk of women's clothing Thomas kept in the spare room, garments that had belonged to Sarah, preserved all these years as a memorial to his lost sister. Seeing Elizabeth in Sarah's riding dress stirred emotions in Thomas that he thought were long buried, not just protective instincts, but something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to love. The ride to Devil's Ridge took them through some of the most beautiful country in Colorado Territory. Rolling grassland gave way to forested hills, and in the distance, snow-capped peaks pierced the morning sky. Under other circumstances, Thomas would have enjoyed sharing this landscape with Elizabeth, showing her the land he'd learned to love over 15 years of solitary life. But today, the beauty was overshadowed by the danger they were riding toward. If the Hartwells discovered that Elizabeth was still alive, if they realized she was gathering evidence against them, they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. "Tell me about your family," Elizabeth said as they rode. "Have you always lived alone out here?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, debating how much to share. "I had a sister once, Sarah. She died in a fire 20 years ago, along with our parents. I've been on my own ever since." "I'm sorry, that must have been terrible." "It was. She was like you, in a way. Stubborn, brave, willing to fight for what she believed in. She died trying to save something she loved." Elizabeth glanced at him with new understanding. "Is that why you helped me? Because I remind you of her?" "Maybe, at first." Thomas looked at her riding beside him, her dark hair catching the morning light, her face determined despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. "But not anymore." "What do you mean?" Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I mean, you're not Sarah, you're Elizabeth. And what I'm feeling for you, it's not about the past." Elizabeth reined in her horse, studying his face with surprise. "Thomas, I know it's crazy," he said quickly. "I know we've only known each other for a few days, and those days have been anything but normal. But Elizabeth, when I pulled you out of that grave, something changed in me. Something I thought was dead came back to life." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I feel it too. I've been trying to tell myself it's just gratitude or shock or the trauma of what happened, but it's more than that." Thomas dismounted and helped her down from her horse. Standing close to her in the morning sunlight, he could see flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could smell the scent of the soap she'd used to wash her hair. "Elizabeth, when this is over, when the Hartwells are brought to justice, would you consider staying? Here, I mean, with me?" Instead of answering with words, Elizabeth rose on her toes and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, soft and tentative, but it sent fire through Thomas's veins. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be," she whispered. They reached Devil's Ridge by midday, and Thomas immediately understood why Elizabeth had chosen this place to hide her evidence. The abandoned mine was hidden in a narrow canyon, invisible from the main trail and accessible only by a treacherous path that wound between towering rock formations. The mine entrance itself was partially collapsed, but Elizabeth led him confidently through the rubble to a shaft that dropped into darkness. Thomas lowered her down on a rope, then followed, carrying lanterns to light their way. 50 feet below ground, they found the hidden chamber Elizabeth had described. It was a natural cave that the miners had expanded, with walls carved from solid rock and a ceiling that disappeared into shadow. And there, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a crevice in the rock wall, was Elizabeth's evidence. Thomas watched in amazement as she unwrapped package after package of documents. Ledgers showing discrepancies in mine payroll records. Bank statements proving that charity funds had been diverted to personal accounts, forged deeds and falsified will documents. It was a treasure trove of evidence that would not only convict the Hartwells of embezzlement, but expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "My God," Thomas breathed, examining a ledger that showed systematic theft from miners' families. They stole pension money from widows and orphans. "That's not even the worst of it," Elizabeth said grimly. "Look at this." She handed him a bundle of correspondence that made his blood run cold. Letters between William Hartwell and territorial officials, discussing bribes paid to ensure that certain mining accidents weren't investigated too closely. References to problems that had been permanently solved when workers asked too many questions about safety violations. "They've been murdering people," Thomas said. "For years. Anyone who threatened to expose their operations just disappeared. The official story was always that they'd left town or had accidents, but the pattern is clear once you know what to look for." Thomas felt a cold rage building in his chest. These weren't just thieves, they were killers who had built their fortune on the blood of innocent people, and they'd tried to add Elizabeth to their list of victims. "We need to get this to someone who can act on it," he said. "Someone the Hartwells can't buy or intimidate." "I've been thinking about that. There's a federal marshal named Cole Harrison who's been investigating corruption in the territorial government. He has a reputation for honesty, and he's got backing from Washington. If anyone can take on the Hartwells, it's him." "Where is he now?" "Last I heard, he was in Denver." But Thomas, even if we can get this evidence to Marshal Harrison, it will take time to build a case. The Hartwells will know I'm alive as soon as we surface with these documents, and they'll do everything in their power to stop us. Thomas carefully rewrapped the evidence and secured it in his saddlebags. Then we'd better be ready for a fight. They made the journey back to the ranch in record time, both aware that every hour they delayed increased the danger. As they approached Thomas's property, everything looked normal. Too normal. The cattle were grazing peacefully, there was no sign of disturbance, and the house stood exactly as they'd left it. But Thomas's instincts, honed by 15 years of frontier life, were screaming that something was wrong. "Stay here," he told Elizabeth, dismounting at the edge of the tree line that bordered his property. "Let me check the house first." "Thomas, if they're here, you'll hear gunshots, and you'll ride for the nearest town as fast as that horse can carry you." Thomas checked his rifle and pistol, then looked at her with fierce intensity. "Promise me, Elizabeth. Promise me you won't try to help if things go bad. This evidence is more important than my life." Elizabeth wanted to argue, he could see it in her eyes. But she also understood that he was right. "I promise. But you promise me, you'll be careful." "I will." Thomas approached his house from the back, using the barn and outbuildings for cover. Everything appeared normal until he noticed something that made his heart sink: fresh horse tracks in the dirt near his front porch. Multiple horses, shod with expensive shoes, city horses. Not the kind used by working ranchers. They were here. Or they had been. Thomas crept closer to the house, peering through windows to check each room. The main floor appeared empty, but when he reached his bedroom window, he saw them. Two men in expensive suits, sitting in chairs they'd pulled up to face the door, waiting. A trap. They knew Elizabeth was with him, and they were waiting for both of them to return. Thomas backed away from the window and circled toward the front of the house, his mind racing. Two men inside, but there could be more outside. He needed to find out how many he was facing before he made his move. That's when he heard the voice that made his blood turn to ice. Mr. Kane called a cultured voice from inside the house. "I know you're out there. My name is William Hartwell, and I believe you have something that belongs to me." Thomas pressed himself against the wall beside his front door, rifle ready. Through the window, he could see an older man with silver hair and expensive clothes standing in his living room. William Hartwell himself had come to clean up his family's mess. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Thomas called back. "I don't have anything that belongs to you." Hartwell's laugh was cold and confident. "Come now, Mr. Kane. We both know that's not true. You found something on your property, or rather, someone, and that someone has been filling your head with lies about my family." "What I found," Thomas said loudly, "was a woman buried alive on my land. Someone tried to murder her, Hartwell. Care to explain that?" Elizabeth Hartwell was a disturbed young woman who stole money from our family businesses before disappearing. If someone buried her, it certainly wasn't anyone connected to my family. Perhaps she arranged it herself to gain sympathy and credibility for her wild accusations. "That's a hell of a story," Thomas replied. "Too bad I don't believe a word of it." "Believe what you like. But I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for her return. $50,000, Mr. Kane. More money than a rancher could make in a lifetime. All you have to do is bring Elizabeth to me, and forget this unfortunate incident ever happened." Thomas felt anger burn hot in his chest. Hartwell was trying to buy him off, just like he'd probably bought off dozens of other people over the years. "And if I refuse, then I'm afraid things will become unpleasant. You see, Mr. Kane, this land you're so proud of was sold to you through fraudulent means. I have documents proving that the sale was illegal, that you've been squatting on property that rightfully belongs to the Hartwell estate. One word from me, and you'll lose everything you've built here." Thomas almost laughed. Hartwell was threatening him with the very crime he'd committed himself, the fraudulent sale of Elizabeth's grandfather's land. "You're forgetting something, Hartwell," Thomas called back. "I'm not the only one who knows the truth about what you've been doing. Even if you kill Elizabeth and me, the evidence will still surface." There was a long pause from inside the house. When Hartwell spoke again, his voice had lost its cultured politeness and turned hard as winter ice. "Then I suppose we'll have to find out where she hid it, won't we? Marcus, bring the coal oil." If Mr. Kane won't be reasonable, perhaps we can persuade him with fire. Thomas's blood went cold. They were going to burn his house down, just like they'd burned down his family's house 20 years ago, killing his parents and Sarah. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. The fire that had destroyed his family hadn't been an accident. The Hartwells had been stealing land and silencing witnesses for decades. His family's death had been just another accident arranged to cover up their crimes. Rage like nothing Thomas had ever felt before flooded through his veins. These monsters hadn't just tried to kill Elizabeth. They had murdered his entire family 20 years ago and gotten away with it. "You killed them," Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You killed my parents and my sister Sarah to steal our land." Hartwell's voice turned mocking. "Oh, you figured that out, have you? I wondered if you'd ever put the pieces together." The Kane family was so stubborn about selling, even when we offered them a fair price. Sometimes fire is the only way to clear title to difficult property. Thomas saw red. Every moment of grief, every year of loneliness, every night he'd blamed himself for not being there to save Sarah. It had all been orchestrated by the monster standing in his living room. He kicked in his own front door with such force that it splintered off its hinges. William Hartwell stood in the center of the room, no longer the cultured gentleman but revealed as the cold-blooded killer he truly was. Behind him, a younger man, Marcus, presumably, held a can of coal oil. "You want a fight, Hartwell?" Thomas snarled, his rifle trained on the older man's chest. "You've got one." What followed was the fastest, most brutal gunfight of Thomas's life. Hartwell was armed but slow, a man more accustomed to ordering murders than committing them personally. Marcus was younger and quicker, but he panicked when the shooting started, his shots going wild. Thomas didn't panic. 20 years of suppressed rage flowed through him as he put bullets exactly where he intended them to go. Hartwell went down first, clutching his chest and gasping like a landed fish. Marcus tried to run, but Thomas's second shot dropped him before he reached the door. In the sudden silence that followed, Thomas stood over the bodies of the men who had destroyed his family. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice served, just a hollow emptiness where his anger had been. "Thomas!" Elizabeth's voice from outside snapped him out of his trance. "Thomas, are you all right?" "I'm fine," he called back. "It's over." Elizabeth rushed into the house and stopped short when she saw the bodies. "William and Marcus," she whispered. "You killed them both." "They killed my family," Thomas said quietly. 20 years ago, they burned down our house and murdered my parents and sister to steal our land, just like they tried to kill you." Elizabeth moved to his side, taking his hand in hers. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm so sorry. It's done now. They can't hurt anyone else." Thomas looked down at William Hartwell's still form. "But we still need to get that evidence to Marshal Harrison. There are probably others involved in this conspiracy." "There are. But Thomas, with William and Marcus dead, proving the rest of it is going to be much harder. They were the only ones who knew all the details." Thomas smiled grimly. "Maybe not. Elizabeth, when you were gathering evidence, did you ever find anything about a fire 20 years ago? About land that was acquired after the owners died in an accident?" Elizabeth's eyes widened with understanding. "The Kane property. Your family's land. If I can prove they murdered your family to steal your property, it establishes a pattern. It shows that the Hartwells have been committing murder to acquire land for decades. And it gives us a federal crime. Murder across territorial boundaries, conspiracy to defraud the government, things that give Marshal Harrison jurisdiction to investigate everything else." They spent the next hour going through William Hartwell's personal effects, looking for anything that might provide additional evidence. In his coat pocket, they found a telegram that made Elizabeth gasp. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "It's from someone named Judge Morrison in Denver. Package delivered as requested. Caffing family eliminated. Payment in usual account. Thomas, this is proof. Proof that they hired someone to kill your family." Thomas stared at the telegram, feeling pieces of a 20-year-old puzzle finally clicking into place. Judge Morrison. I remember that name from the inquest into the fire. He ruled it was accidental, closed the case without a real investigation. Because he was being paid by the Hartwells to cover up their crime. Elizabeth clutched the telegram to her chest. "Thomas, we have them. We have proof not just of the embezzlement, but of murder, conspiracy, judicial corruption, everything. Thomas looked around his home, seeing the bullet holes in the walls, the blood on his floor, the bodies of the men who had haunted his life for 20 years. Tomorrow, he would have to ride to the nearest town and report what had happened. There would be questions, investigations, probably a trial. But tonight, there was only Elizabeth and the knowledge that justice had finally been served. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, as if reading his thoughts. "Now, we make sure the truth comes out. We get this evidence to Marshal Harrison, and we make sure every person the Hartwells wronged gets justice." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "And then, if you'll have me, we build a life together on land that's finally free of blood and lies." Elizabeth looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears and hope. "I can't think of anything I want more." Outside, the Colorado wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of winter and renewal. The land that had been bought with murder and theft was finally clean, watered with the justice that had been too long delayed. In the months that followed, Marshal Harrison's investigation would expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Dozens of officials would be arrested, millions of dollars in stolen money would be returned to its rightful owners, and the families of murder victims would finally learn the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Thomas and Elizabeth would marry in the spring, in a ceremony attended by many of the people who had been helped by the evidence Elizabeth had gathered. Judge Morrison would be arrested and convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, finally paying for his role in the Kane family's death. But all of that was still to come. Tonight there was only the warmth of the fire, the comfort of Elizabeth's presence, and the peace that came from knowing that sometimes justice was worth waiting for. Thomas Kane had spent 15 years building a life on land watered with his family's blood. Now finally, he could begin building a future on ground that was truly his own. If this story of justice delayed but not denied touched your heart, if you believe that some secrets are worth dying to protect and some truths are worth living to expose, then you found your home at Western Love Stories. Here, where the frontier was unforgiving but love was stronger, we tell tales of hearts that refused to surrender to corruption, of souls that found light in the darkest conspiracies, and of the truth that love and justice together can overcome even the deepest evil.